Hello, world historians. It is me, Mr. Leatherwood, and I'm coming at you through your audio channels. We are unable to meet for hurricane reasons, so we are going to have a little meeting here through the audio. So, in case you haven't heard, we are going to be testing on Chapter 6, The Day You Come Back. I know you're very excited about that, but because of that, I wanted to make sure that you guys are properly prepared, and that is why I'm going to do kind of an audio lecture on Chapter 6, and I'll kind of throw a little bit of a test review in at the end. So hang tight for that. This should be very helpful. So we are on Chapter 6, which, as you already know, is all about Eurasian social hierarchies, okay, from 500 BCE to 500 CE. So let's talk about the four things that we're going to cover here today. We have society and the state in China. We have class and caste in India. We have slavery, the case of the Roman Empire. And then finally, we're going to kind of compare some patriarchies. Remember, patriarchy is a system of organization where men are dominating women, and women are subordinate to men in pretty much all respects. So that's what we're going to look at today, and then, like I said, we will do a little test review. So let's pretty much get started. So society and the state in China. China had a very powerful state. Unlike many other civilizations at this time, China's state bureaucracy system was very advanced, and we know that because of, in particularly, the professional civil service that they had. Right, so this is the first professional civil service examination. No longer are they giving out jobs to their brothers and their brother's mother and their brother's friends. Well, maybe not the mother, right? These are patriarchies. But their brother's friends and their uncles and things like that. You're actually going to have to take a test to get into the elite official ranks, right? And the elite officials are going to be at the top of this hierarchy. There's going to be four kind of loosely organized classes in classical China. You have the elite officials, the landlord class, the peasants, and then the merchants. So let's get going. Officials. Wu Di is going to establish this imperial academy. It's going to get up to about 30,000 students by the end of the Han Dynasty. Remember, that dynasty comes right after the Qin. Now, this system is going to last really up until the early 20th century. So it did favor the wealthy primarily. So although there was some social mobility in China, it primarily favored people who could afford to pay for all the books and education that it took to study for these examinations. Hopefully you remember the poem called Passing the Examination. He had studied for 10 years to get to this elite status. Now, remember, just like in our society, while we have a lot more social mobility, it's still not probably equally possible for everyone to go to an Ivy League college like Harvard, Princeton, Yale, etc. Now, it is possible, and we do hear stories of people who grew up without a whole lot, who worked really hard and were able to get there. But it's mostly going to be more accessible for those who have money to send their kids to private schools and to pay for tutors and to do SAT practices and those sorts of things, which is also how it was in China, right? Primarily the wealthy, but you will hear stories of a pig farmer son who's able to make it to the top class, the officials. So these people had great privileges and prestige. They're going to be on the top, okay? Now, below them is the landlord class. And this landlord class didn't really always exist in the way that they come to exist by the Han Dynasty. Now, initially during the Qin, many of the peasants kind of owned a lot of the land. But by the 1st century BCE, they're going to be displaced by landowners and tenant farmers. Now, state-opposed creation of large estates is going on throughout Chinese history. It even echoes into Mao Zedong's rule in the 1950s, where he's going to try to redistribute land and create this sort of communal living situation. We're going to have the same thing here with a guy named Wang Mang, or perhaps Wang Mang. In our class, we said either one works as long as it rhymes. We were happy. Now, why would Wang Mang want to have these reforms? Well, he wanted to redistribute land and make this sort of more available for all the peasants because he felt that that was the right thing to do. Now, why would he want to do that? Well, these large landowners could often evade paying taxes. Sometimes they had independent military forces like armies, and they could challenge the emperor. They could challenge the authority of the officials. So there's kind of a natural tension between these two people. Now, do you think that the landlord class liked Wang Meng or Wang Meng? No, right? They did not like him, and unsurprisingly, with their power, they were able to assassinate him and return an emperor who wasn't going to have these reforms back to the throne. Now, below this second class, so far we've talked about the elite officials and the landlord class. There are the peasants, which in Confucian ideology they are considered a quite revered and really important, the kind of backbone of society, right? They're doing all the farming, and some are prosperous and others are barely surviving. There is periodic rebellions, peasant rebellions, often because of these people, like the landlord class, evading taxes. And then if there is a famine or a flood, then they're going to have to still pay the same taxes. Or if they're going to war, they're going to raise taxes, and the taxes are going to be raised on the peasants. And the peasants are not always going to be able to do that, so they're going to have these rebellions. Now, one of the most famous rebellions of this time is known as the Yellow Turban Rebellion, about 184 CE, provoked by flooding and epidemics, right? Because they're not going to have the kind of crops to satisfy the imperial demands. Now, these peasant revolts devastated the economy and eventually kind of led to the overthrow of the Han Dynasty. Now, these peasants essentially went out to the land and kind of converted to a mystical version of Taoism and dreamed of this great peace that would come where everyone lived kind of without a real strong state, kind of an anarchist sort of dream that this could happen. They're eventually suppressed by the Han Dynasty, and that's going to come to an end. Now, below the peasants, which this is kind of interesting, are the merchants. So the Chinese cultural elite disliked merchants. They were kind of stereotyped as being greedy and profiting off of others and essentially just raising prices for moving things. Now, today, people don't really feel this way about merchants, right? We believe that they offer a valuable service. Think of someone like Amazon. I love Amazon, and I love to shop online, and many of you probably do as well. And that's essentially a huge merchant industry who just moves products from one place to another and takes some profit in the meantime. Well, they felt like they weren't creating anything new, and they wanted to control them. So the elite passed laws to forbid them from holding public office. They created state monopolies on certain industries so that they couldn't make any profit on them, such as salt, iron, and alcohol. And they forced them to make loans to the state. Despite all of this efforts, merchants still made a lot of money, and they tried to get their respectability by purchasing estates or educating their sons. And although many officials did not have a lot of respect for them and didn't want to work with them, there were some corrupt officials who would work with these merchants nonetheless. Now, the interesting thing is that merchants were not well liked, but they lived a good life. Peasants, however, were well liked and kind of praised in Confucian ideology, but they often did not live a good life. And so this is kind of an interesting situation here in classical China. We're going to move to South Asia and go to India. Here we're going to talk about caste as Varna. Now, the word caste comes from the Portuguese meaning race, kind of purity of blood. And the kind of current historical thinking about this is that there were some Indo-European people, light-skinned, who came into contact with the native people, the dark-skinned people, and this sort of, from this interaction, these diverse people, this sort of system originally developed, right? They knew that something was different about them, and that developed. Now, Eventually, this caste system traditionally is thought to be kind of created through the breaking up of a god named Purusha. So the god's head became the Brahmins, right? The priests, the arms, the strong arms became the warriors, the Kshatriya, and the Vaishya became the which came from the legs. They were eventually became known as the merchant class, kind of your workers, kind of a business class. Now, all three of these were known as the twice born because they were born once into their bodies, right, and another time into their castes. So they are known as the twice born, the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaisyas. But there are also the Shudras who come from the feet, and they are not twice born. They are kind of not even considered Aryan. They are not respected nearly as much. Eventually below them is going to be these untouchables who sometimes have to wear bells so people know that they're coming. And if a Brahmin were to be in the same room with an untouchable, he may become ritually polluted, and he's going to have to do all these rituals to get clean again. And it's a really interesting thing about the kind of Indian ideology at the time. Now, moving on from there, in addition to this, there are going to be these things called jatis. Now, this is another element of the caste system. So the caste consists of this varna, right, your four kind of main classes, but then each of those classes, like the Brahmins and the Kshatriya and the Vaishya and the Sudras, are going to be subdivided into further classes based on occupations. So within each of the castes, varna, there's going to be, based on occupations or guilds, these jatis. Now, this creates the whole caste system, and it's the primary kind of access point for social life is your jati. Now, you had marriage and eating together is only going to be allowed within an individual's jati. They each have their own rules and obligations, and there's they're going to largely play the role of the state. The state is going to kind of be absent in India. If you compare it to like the strong state presence of China, India is going to be a lot less. India is going to be a lot less strong of a state, and therefore the castes are also going to serve a lot of state functions like providing for orphans and food and the lowly and the poor and those sorts of things. Now, what were the functions of this caste? What did it do? Well, on one level, it kind of justified the inequality in the social class in India, right? Because you have these four classes which are also subdivided, but they're supposedly eternal. These castes were created by a god, and in fact, where you were in that caste was largely supposed to be determined on your past lives. So the idea was that if you did good or bad deeds in a previous life, that would be the karma is going to put you into one class or another. Now, in order to get reborn to a higher caste, you need to do your duty and keep your head down. You don't need if you're a Sudra and you're a farmer, you do not need to have any kind of aspirations about trying to become a priest. In fact, that would be not exercising your dharma, which is your kind of duty as a person in this caste. If you do exercise that dharma, you do what you're told, then perhaps you will have good karma and you will get reincarnated into a higher caste. Now, this obviously is going to kind of exploit the poor, keep them down, give them a reason to not try to rise up. And so we're going to see less, although we're still going to see some, we're going to see less rebellions, like peasant rebellions and things like that in India, because many of them are trying to kind of live out their dharma. Now, was there any social mobility in India, though? You would think not. Well, right, entire jatis could move ahead. So an entire kind of occupational class could become more important. I like to think of how before Hollywood and motion pictures, so before Thomas Edison kind of creates these motion pictures and then Hollywood takes over and these movies get really popular, actors and actresses in the United States weren't that terribly popular or important. They worked in plays and Broadway, things like that. But once movies become really popular and you start to have movie stars, right? You think of like James Dean and all these big names. Like the entire, occupational class of actor and actresses becomes a lot more higher in social status. So entire occupational classes could move up, but you would still be within that jati. Now, overall, this made it a little bit more difficult for there to be a strong state in India, but there was a strong culture. So strong culture, weak state. What about slavery in the Roman Empire? So why did slavery even emerge? Well, there's various theories that exist, right? Some people say that the domestication of animals provided this model for human slavery, right? So if you bring an animal into your control, well, maybe we can do the same thing with people. They are animals after all. Some other people think things like private property. So once there was war and people started to take property, that these ideas extended naturally to people. And now, okay, well, if I can own things, maybe I can own a person too. Also, large-scale warfare definitely contributed to this as well, because when you would take prisoners of war, many times they would become slaves. Now, the kind of last kind of ideas that it might have came from the patriarchy, the idea of ownership of women could have then extended on to men, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that women were some of the first people that were enslaved. Now, slavery was a long tradition. Almost all civilizations had some kind of form, but in some societies it was much more common than others and made up a large part of its workforce. So thinking of, the South in the kind of Cotton Kingdom in the United States, kind of thinking around, 1800s, late 1700s, the entire economy was based on slavery. Well, similarly in Rome and Greece, they worked a lot of different occupations, but not so much in China and India. They played less of a role. So, in India, it would largely be criminals or debtors or war captives that would become slaves, largely domestic, and religion gave them a lot of protections. In China, maybe 1% of the population were enslaved compared to, if you think of the Roman Empire, maybe 40%, Greece maybe 30%, and if you think of the United States, where the majority of the people living in certain states and cities at the time were slaves. So a little bit different. Now, let's get a little bit more into Roman slavery. Let's talk about Roman slavery. It played an immense role. So in Greece, so kind of talking about Greco-Roman slavery, about a third of the population were enslaved in Athens. Aristotle would say that some people were slaves by nature. It was their natural position to be kind of subjected to that, subjugated. In the Roman Empire, it was close to 33 to 40% slaves. Wealthy Romans owned slaves, and even people without a lot of money, modest means, might own a couple slaves too. People became slaves because of war. Pirates would get engaged in the slave trade, kind of steal people and sell them to slavers, and things like that. Natural reproduction, so if a slave had a child in Rome, they were often still considered slaves. This also happened in the New World, but not so in certain societies. Their children were not considered slaves. Interesting though, however, unlike slavery in the New World, this was not based on race. This was not race-based. Lots of different types of people and ethnic groups were become enslaved. It was not based on skin color as it would become in the New World. And also, slaves did all sorts of types of jobs, particularly in Rome. It was almost indistinguishable from free labor. Slave labor and free labor was the same. You had doctors who were slaves. You had actors who were slaves. You had also farmers and lowly workers who were slaves. So they performed both prestigious and degraded tasks. But don't get too ahead of yourself. Slaves still had no legal rights. They could not marry legally. And there was really, really, really strict punishments. So, for example, if a slave murdered his master, all of that master's slaves would have to be killed. Whereas if a master killed their slave, it was not considered to be such a crime. But manumission, which means to free one, to free a slave, was pretty common. Roman freedmen also became citizens, where this did not happen in Athens. So it was also common in Athens for people to leave slavery. Slavery was not a permanent condition as it would become in the New World, in the United States. It was a little bit of a permeable wall. You could move in and out of slavery. But in Rome, you actually became a citizen when you became free. So that was one kind of unique feature of Roman slavery. What about resistance and rebellion? Are there any resistance and rebellion? Well, some slaves would commit mass suicide to avoid slavery. Some would do kind of small things, steal stuff, sabotage things, break tools, things like that. Some people would actually murder their owners, but remember, there was really strict punishment, and you're going to get all of the slaves killed that the owner owned. And there were some rebellions. They weren't super common, but they did happen, and the most famous one was led by Spartacus. So perhaps you've seen the HBO series called Spartacus, or you at least know the story. There's an old movie as well, but this happens in 73 BCE, and it's going to eventually be unsuccessful. But these people were not trying to end slavery. They just wanted to free themselves. We're not going to see anything on a similar scale as far as a slavery revolt until Haiti in the 1790s, where they are going to rebel. About 500,000 slaves are going to kind of rise up during a civil war, during the Napoleonic Wars, and take over Haiti, and it's going to kind of create the first kind of free black nation. And we're not going to see any kind of rebellion on these levels until that time. So, you're looking at another 1,800 years before you see another slave revolt of that size. Let's compare patriarchies. First thing to note is that gender systems change over time. Remember, we're always looking at continuities and change. One of the most striking continuities throughout world history is the persistence of patriarchy and gender systems, right? Women being subjected to men, having to obey them, listen to them, and this is going to be pretty persistent and not really challenged until the last half of the 20th century with the women's movement all around the world. And in some places, this is still one of the most continuous features of history that bleeds into the present. Now, initially in civilization, the patriarchy was less restrictive. It existed, but your pastoral and your nomadic people, they're going to have a little bit more freedom, the women, and they're going to be active in family life and things like that. But this is still going to be within a patriarchal framework. And sometimes there was interactions between patriarchy and class. So sometimes the greatest restrictions, although they have a better life in sense of a quality of life, upper class women sometimes were going to be even more restricted because they didn't have to work, and so they didn't get any kind of freedom from working or going outside the home to do things or build things or work. They largely just had to kind of be stuck in the house. And in fact, that was one of the things that people in ancient Greece would talk about, is that the proper role of a woman is in the house. So they were not meant to be seen. And that was their kind of role. Now, what about China? Well, in the Han Dynasty, Li ideas became more patriarchal once Confucianism kind of took over, because remember, Confucianism is a very male-dominated idea, right? You need to be respectful to the father. The emperor is a kind of father figure, and so early on there was less of a strict patriarchy. But by the time Confucianism in the Han Dynasty kind of becomes the official state ideology, the women's sphere is going to become purely domestic. The men are public, right? Woman needs to be subordinate to father, husband, and son. There were some exceptions, however. There were few women who had political authority. Some of them, there were writers who praised virtuous women as wise counselors. there was a lot of honor given to the mother of sons. So mother-in-laws exercised extreme power. Now, they had a strong dowry. The woman did when they got married. They were valued as textile producers, and a wife also had more status than a concubine. So remember, a concubine is going to be kind of a step above a slave, a person who has to kind of stick around and is used largely for sex, or perhaps to make babies if the wife is unable to. Now, peasant women labored in the fields and did not have the same sort of seclusion that upper-class women had. Now, what about the collapse of the Han Dynasty? How did that affect the patriarchy in China? Now, one would think perhaps that with the collapse of a dynasty and the strong norms, that there would be less restriction, and that's kind of what happens. It's also because of the nomadic peoples. Remember, nomadic people are going to have less patriarchal societies, and they're going to come in and invade. And by the Tang Dynasty, there are elite women regarded as capable of handling lots of legal and business affairs, inheriting property, and even riding horses. So they're kind of a major sign of the weakening patriarchy is the ruling of Empress Wu. Now, Empress Wu is kind of a controversial figure. She's kind of sometimes referred to as evil Empress Wu. She's the only woman to ever have the title of emperor in China. She's going to be there from 690 to 705 CE. She's going to support the arts, though. She's going to get people to write books about women and kind of write biographies of them. And this is also a time where Taoism was more popular, and so was Buddhism, and those both offered a little bit more freedom for women's roles. They were kind of, Taoism was sort of more associated with nature and letting things happen, and women were also quote-unquote seen as passive, right? They were the yang to the yin, and therefore the prominence of Taoism also kind of brought women to prominence as well. Now, what about if we try to compare and contrast the patriarchies of Athens and Sparta? What do we see? Well, Athens and Sparta had different views about women, right? These were also different societies. Sparta was a kind of militaristic, totalitarian city-state. Athens was the birthplace of democracy. So how one would think perhaps that the birthplace of democracy must have granted more freedom to women. Wrong. So let's get into it. In Athens, they're completely excluded from public life. They are not even named when there's court proceedings. They're just referred to as like the sister of this person, or the wife of that person, or the mother of that person. Aristotle also talks about their kind of natural inadequacy compared to males. They're supposed to stay in the home. Also, women are going to be kind of paired up with a mate, married in their mid-teens, right, 14, 15 years old, to men 10 to 15 years older. So that's going to kind of reinforce the unequal status. Not only are they women, but they're having to marry these older men who have had a lot more time to kind of mature and learn things, and it's going to kind of keep women in this sort of unequal status. Their kind of main role is going to be to manage the house and to have men as sons, to have sons, not daughters, right? Women could only negotiate some small things. There's really only one notable exception, a woman named Aspasia, who is going to kind of marry Pericles, and she's going to live a pretty interesting public life, but she is an exception and not the norm. So what about Sparta, right? How would Sparta give any more access for women to be free? Well, let's think about it. Sparta, remember, is this militaristic city-state, which perhaps is functioned that way because they had a bunch of people subordinated under them, subjugated, which were the Helots, and they were kind of concerned that the Helots might stage a rebellion. So they needed to have this strong militaristic campaign. Boys would train for 25 years to become warriors, and women needed to be strong to have strong men. Right? Now, this gave women more freedom because, one, the men were away, often battling in war or training, so women were a little bit more freedom around the house to do things and move around the city. And the central task was reproduction, so women were encouraged to take part in sporting events, to train, to get strong. Some of them would do things in the nude, and these things were all kind of done publicly. So they weren't secluded or segregated. They wore lighter clothing. People in Athens thought the women had way too much power. They would kind of mock the Spartan men for listening to the women. What a terrible thing to do, right? Of course not, right? It's a good thing. So also, women would marry men of about the same age. So about at 18, they would marry, and divorce was possible. But Sparta, unlike Athens, is going to discourage any kind of homosexuality, whereas some Greek states will approve it. And women were freer in Sparta and more secluded in democratic Athens, which is kind of interesting. So basically, things look a little bit differently when you look at it through the eyes of gender. What's a better way to look at this? Is it better to look at things as everything there's nothing new under the sun, that nothing has changed, or that the world is in a state of impermanence and flux? Well, as historians, we have to look at things from both perspectives. We need to look at the change that has taken place and the continuities. And so we see that that some of these things have been highly durable, such as China's kind of scholar gentry class, India's caste system, which still exists today, slavery, which went on unquestioned till the 19th century, and patriarchy has been pretty fundamental and durable to a lot of civilizations. But also things have changed. The Greek conquest of the Persian Empire and the spread of Greek ideas all throughout the Hellenistic period was very unique and new, and created lots of new cities and new ideas and clashed of civilizations. The Roman Empire, when they unified the Mediterranean and created their kind of empire, brought a lot of people together with new ideas and new laws. Buddhism and Christianity both become universal religions. They had not existed, then they existed, and they were a big deal to a lot of people. And Rome is going to convert to Christianity, and then the collapse of dynasties. So, right, the Han's going to collapse, the Tang's going to collapse, a Roman Empire is going to collapse, and that is a change that is very important. So both change and continuity are extremely important when looking at history.